Hello and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. I'm Shuri and I read and talk about Black books. A couple videos ago I was talking about the book Beloved by Toni Morrison and some of the Gothic aspects that are found in it, like oppressive atmosphere, suspenseful setting, intense emotions, supernatural forces, isolation, and characters trapped by their circumstances. And while reading The Street by Ann Petry, I started noticing those same elements again and again in this book as well, but just in a very different way. It took me a while to realize what I was reading. Again, this book was recommended to me as a Gothic read, and I was really skeptical at first because there was nothing in the synopsis that immediately jumped out to me as this being a haunting or Gothic type book. But as I continued to read it, it really dawned on me that this is another one that is looked over as Gothic. The first thing you're going to see in this book is actually two things. The first one is something that I had a little trouble with identifying in Beloved, the metonymy. And thank you to everyone who helped me point out some more examples of the metonymy in Beloved. Metonymy is a figure of speech consisting of the use of the name of one thing for that of another of which it is an attribute or which it is associated. So basically using something to mean something else. The example that makes it make sense for me is the use of rain to symbolize sorrow. Like you'll see a lot of times in media when they're showing a funeral, it's always raining. And I'm assuming that's to mean sorrow or sadness. It was so much easier to identify in this book, and it's kind of a common theme throughout the book. And there are quite a few examples of the metonymy in this book. The first one that really jumps out also has to do with the weather. For me, how I took it was being used to symbolize despair and poverty. And like the reason I chose to discuss this one is because it kind of represents another aspect of Gothic literature, maybe even two aspects of Gothic literature in this book. I'll go ahead and read like the first few sentences of the book, and maybe you can see if you can identify it as well. There was a cold November wind blowing through 116th Street. It rattled the tops of garbage cans, sucked window shades out through the top of the open windows, and set them flapping back against the windows. And it drove most of the people off the street in the block between 7th and 8th Avenues, except for a few hurried pedestrians who bent double in an effort to offer the least possible exposed surface to its violent assault. It found every scrap of paper along the street. Theater throwaways, announcements of dances and lodge meetings, the heavy wax paper that loaves of bread had been wrapped up in, the thinner wax paper that had enclosed sandwiches, old envelopes, newspaper, fingering its way along the curb. The wind set the bits of paper to dancing high in the air, so that a barrage of paper swirled into the faces of the people on the street. It even took time to rush into the doorways and airways and find chicken bones and pork chop bones and push them along the curb. It did everything it could to discourage the people walking along the street. It found all the dirt and dust and grime on the sidewalk and lifted it up so that the dirt got into their noses, making it difficult to breathe. The dust got into their eyes and blinded them, and the grit stung their skins. It wrapped newspaper around their feet, entangling them until the people cursed deep in their throats, stamped their feet, kicked at the paper. The wind blew it back again and again until they were forced to stoop and dislodge the paper with their hands. And then the wind grabbed their hats, pried their scarves from around their necks, stuck its fingers inside their coat collars, and blew their coats away from their bodies. Okay, that was like 3 paragraphs actually, but that writing was so good. So see if you can identify the metonymy in those sentences. So, and like the second thing from reading those passages as well that I immediately saw as Gothic was another aspect that I came across in my research, and I didn't talk about this in the Beloved video, but it was something that was also seen in Beloved as well. It's nature, specifically a wild and untamed nature is a common aspect found in Gothic literature. As you can see, she does this really well in the first 3 paragraphs of this book. The weather is doing a lot, and for such a simple thing, it really begins to set the tone for the rest of the book. So yeah, already In the beginning of the book, you have the metonymy, you have the wild and untamed nature, and depending on how you look at it, you also have a little bit of the supernatural. But as we already see in this story, and as we'll see further along in the story, the Gothic often uses things to describe emotional states. And in the street, it's the environment itself that becomes very symbolic of forces that are shaping Ludi's life. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so all that is before we even get to the setting. The setting is kind of like the main thing one notices about Gothic literature. So traditionally in Gothic stories, the story itself is centered or takes place in some type of haunting structure or architecture. It's commonly a castle or a mansion or some ruins or even just a house. But the first thing I noticed in the street was that there was not going to be one central structure being the oppressive force in this book. The city is replacing those structures. The street is the setting. It's the neighborhood. It's the apartment building. It's the people. It's the poverty. All of that is contributing to the setting. And I'm not sure if Ann Petry knew this back then, but it really gives us a whole new perspective to the Gothic setting. It's just like a whole different way of looking at it. And it's not something that everybody can relate to, or that everybody can see. So I can see why this book is probably passed over as Gothic and more into the historical fiction or general fiction. But the neighborhood is really the oppressive force in this book. It's not just one structure working against the character or trapping a character anymore, or it doesn't have to be, as we see with the street. The environment can be a Gothic setting too. And here's a good example. It was a bad street. And then she thought about the other streets. It wasn't just this street that she was afraid of or that was bad. It was any street where people were packed together like sardines in a can. And it wasn't just this city. It was the city where they set up a line and say black folks stay on this side and white folks stay on this side. So that black folks were crammed on top of each other, jammed and packed and forced into the smallest possible space until they were completely cut off from light and air. So yeah, so she says it, it's not just any one structure anymore. It doesn't have to be. You have no idea what's going to happen in this book, but something bad is coming. Like you feel that sense of dread. It made this book so intense. I was just so scared something was going to happen to Ludi, and I didn't want anything to happen to her. But there was so much tension and unease in the apartment building itself. The tenants were unpredictable, kind of seedy. You never knew if their actions were going to benefit Ludi or come her demise. You didn't know if they were plotting against her. And you didn't know if she would find safety with her neighbors or the other tenants. Same with some of the other characters in the book. Because just when I thought the dread was going to be just limited to the apartment building, it started seeping out onto the street in the neighborhood and kind of following Ludi wherever she went as well. That's a kind of a big aspect of Gothic literature. It's when the world around the character starts to feel unsafe. Something bad could happen at any moment, and Ludi had no idea just how unsafe she was. So that was the atmosphere. Now, let's talk a little bit about the supernatural. The definition of the supernatural is some force beyond scientific understanding or laws of nature. And Gothic stories usually have some type of supernatural force, whether it be ghosts or omens or curses or just other spooky entities. The supernatural element in this story is either something you believe in or you don't. I love the way that Ann Petry wrote it as if the supernatural had a reasonable explanation, if that makes sense. It was something that one character did to another character, and the other character didn't know it was being done to them. They were just unknowingly controlled by the actions of it. That doesn't make sense unless you know. unless you've read it or kind of guess what I'm talking about. But let's reach a little bit and say there are some haunting elements in this book. In my last video, I talked about a quote that I noticed in the book. It said being haunted by the fear of not being able to pay your rent. You see poverty becoming this haunting force throughout this entire book. But there's no literal ghosts or entities in this book. Generational poverty and systemic racism are the haunting forces trolling Ludi and Bub's life. And I guess those are kind of like ghosts because they are invisible and they are powerful. And those types of fears are very real for people. For Ludi, it was a source of her overwhelming fear that the streets were going to do something to Bub. And overwhelming emotions in the Gothic are called the sublime, but it's usually some form of fear. And we typically think of monsters and ghosts, but in the street, there's this overwhelming fear of survival. There's this desperation, and there's this overwhelming anger at the systems in place against the people and the injustices stacked up against Ludi and the others, which is not something she can openly discuss with anyone. She kind of has no one in the book, and she keeps it bottled up inside. And when her anger does seep out, it's usually directed at the wrong person. She comes to realize she can't say these things in front of him for fear that he's going to take it into his own hands and go out to the streets for help. And no matter how hard she tries to make a better life for herself and for Bub, with everything that's stacked up against her, there's just this overwhelming sense of hopelessness within Ludi. Overall, just overwhelming fear that the street is going to be her and Bub's demise. That's kind of like the overall sublime in this book, but there are some examples of other characters experiencing overwhelming emotions as well. You have Min, who goes to extreme measures to make sure that she does not get put out. We got Mrs. Hedges and whatever happened to her in her past. Then we have Bub, who is extremely afraid of being home alone. The super, when he comes across the cross, even like Ludi's fear of the apartment building and the stairs are just a few examples of the sublime in this book. And with these overwhelming fears, especially with Ludi's, she becomes a woman in distress, a woman in quiet distress, because again, like I said, she can't talk about it. But I also say quiet distress because there are other factors quietly at play that are stacking up against her that she has no idea of. There's also this sense in the book that nobody in that building is going to help her if she ever needed it. And I think she kind of feels that, and like she has nowhere to go for help if it was needed. She has no family except for her father, in which he's pretty useless. No friends, no love life. It's really just her and Bub. She is isolated, which isolation is another big aspect of Gothic literature. And she has no idea of the other predators quietly plotting against her. There were so many factors quietly building up against Ludi. And it just shows that in addition to people, it's also the systems in place and everyday structures of society that cause crushing anxiety and distress. One of the most important aspects of Gothic literature, and I'm saying this for like all of them, but a really big one is the past, particularly a past that doesn't stay in the past. In Beloved, we saw the past physically manifest itself into the present. But in the street, it's a past that never goes away. It's been there. We see a very important backstory in the street that kind of shapes the main character's trajectory into her present timeline. And she refers to this, she looks back on this a lot and thinks of it as one of the contributors into her current situation. So it causes her a lot of melancholy. because it was kind of a damned if she does, damned if she doesn't type of situation. There was really nothing she could do other than what she did. But there's also this bigger picture past that influences most of the book. It's the actual past of the city of Harlem and racial discrimination, economic inequality, housing segregation, overall limited opportunities for people, in which we're seeing all of these things are still happening even today. We see all of that affecting Ludi because there's always something she needs to do before she can advance in her career. These things were in place long before Ludi even moved to the street. And it was something that she came from. She was literally born into it, this cycle of poverty, of generational struggle, of discrimination. But the more she tries to escape it, the deeper she digs herself into despair. And it's so messed up because you want to see her win, but it's just not happening for her. That constant tension between hope and despair that creates so much pressure in this book. And something I'm really starting to learn with doing these analyses is that Gothic stories are not so much about what's happening, but more about how the character is experiencing the world around them. And reading The Street and Beloved through this Gothic lens is showing me that Gothic stories tend to be more character driven than plot driven. These stories aren't built around like these major plot twists and turns and events. They're more about experiencing what's going on in the character's mind. We spend a lot of time in Ludi's mind. There are also other characters in whose mind we get to experience as well. But Ludi is the main character, and we spend a lot of time in her head. You watch her become mentally and physically and emotionally cornered. And that's all because of the environment that she's in. So it's not really the plot pushing these stories forward. I would say it's really the setting, because with The Street, everything that happens comes back to the street. In Beloved, everything kind of came back to the house, or prior to the other house in Kentucky, the plantation or whatever. Everything comes back to the setting. And The Street itself is kind of shaping Ludi's life. I'm so convinced that this is a Gothic novel, and I would go as far to say is that this is like a blueprint for modern Gothic literature. If you take all the aspects that I talked about, the metonymy, the sublime, the suspenseful atmosphere, the setting, the past shaping the present, women in distress, nature, it all points back to the main antagonist of this book, which is the environment, which is the street. And this was very, very, very well done. For a book published in 1946, it's still relevant 80 years later. You can take everything that I talked about in this book and relate it to life today. And a good example of this book relating to life today, you will see in the book The Curse of Hester Gardens by Tamika Thompson, which is a modern Gothic horror book. Reading those two books, you see a lot of similarities. It's a lot of similarities. The Curse of Hester Gardens comes out on March 31st. It's a modern Gothic horror story set in the projects. So you can already see some similarities to The Street in that it's going to be another one that some people are not going to understand. They are not going to relate to. They're just not going to get it, but it really does explore those same similar themes as in The Street, and it's really good, but it has a little bit more horror in the story. Okay, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm just a reader. I was not an English major. I'm not a literary professional or expert. I just like to read books. I think the Gothic genre is actually really fascinating, and I'm really enjoying doing these analyses through books by Black authors, getting these different experiences and looking at it in a different perspective. I think this book was a masterpiece. The Street was such a good book. I highly recommend it. The audio is read by Danielle Deadwyler, who is such an underrated actress. She is amazing. If you've seen any of her movies or shows that she's done, she's so underrated, and I think she's about to be a problem because she's getting ready to be in the X-Files reboot by Ryan Coogler. So I'm really excited for that. But she really brings Ludi's character to life in this book, and she does a really good job. Also, 40 Acres is like a top 5 movie. It should be up there with Sinners, I think, personally. I also think I saw somewhere that this is going to be adapted into a movie. Did I see that? Does anybody else know, or am I making this up? But I think I did see that. Somebody let me know. Also, what do you think about Linden Hills by Gloria Naylor being Gothic? Because that was next on my list. I think I have one more heavy read in me before I start to get into more spring and summer Gothic books. Also, shout out and thank you to Ophelia for putting me on Windward Heights. I'm so excited to read this book and hopefully, possibly get into some Gothic romance. So thank you so much for telling me about that book. A lot of y'all have been asking for some Southern Gothic analyses, and I'm still trying to teach myself the Southern Gothic genre. I have some syllabi that I'm kind of going through, and a lot of y'all want me to do the Reformatory. I would have to read that again, and I don't really want to read that again because that book, I just remember that book was a lot. But if you have any insights on some Southern Gothic horror, some Black Southern Gothic horror books, let me know your recommendations in the comments as well. I've read When the Reckoning Comes, The Reformatory, Spook Lights, and most of Eden Royce's books. And I was thinking about Hoodoo by Ronald L. Smith. I'll read that one again, but let me know some more Black Southern Gothic horror books in the comments. Okay, like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching.